As we continue our whirlwind journey through the history of the Bible in China, we're going to see how missionary translation efforts culminated in a successful Union version that achieved unprecedented and unimagined impact and lasting acceptance and use. We're going to see more intimate descriptions of what went on behind the scenes, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and see how God made possible what was impossible with man. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this episode, and you may even want to divide it into two parts because it's a bit longer. I'm Andrew Case, and you're listening to Working for the Word. Before we get into the beginning of the Union version, I want to mention this really interesting little snippet of history about a guy named Yan Fu. So Yan was the most influential translator of Western works into Chinese. His translations included titles by authors like T.H. Huxley, A. Smith, and E. Spencer. In the preface to his translation of Huxley's Evolution and Ethics, published in 1893, Yan formed the basis of a Chinese translation theory, which is used up to the present day to judge translations, including Bible translations. The three central terms in his theory are faithfulness, conveyance of meaning, and elegance of style. Yan also translated the first 4 chapters of the Gospel of Mark, which was published in 1908 and was inaugurated and supported by the British and Foreign Bible Society. Bonfield, the agent of the British and Foreign Bible Society, was told by an intelligent and progressive Chinese gentleman that the style in our Wenli versions of the Bible was inferior to the style of the best non-Christian books, and thus approached Yan to translate the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. A note by Bonfield on the back cover of the translation read, "This experimental translation in current Wenli has been made without the aid of any foreigner from the New Testament in English. The translator, however, has had copies of existing Wenli versions of the New Testament before him for reference." End quote. For important terminology, Yan referred to other Chinese translations, but not as far as stylistic or interpretational matters. So his translation does have Shangdi for God and other common terms of Christian usage from the other Bible translations. But in other passages, his version displays an interpretational method of translation and great freedom from former translations. Now, Yan was not a Christian, and he started this Bible translation because he hoped to make the Bible a great classic for the Chinese. The language that he employed was classical Chinese, in which he tended to use 2-syllable terms. Whereas the Delegates version has the 3-character phrase, "prepare the Lord's way," in the first part of Mark 1:3, Yan used twice as many characters, but all of his terms are of classical use. Yan's style was enthusiastically praised by Chinese Christians and even by the contemporary Chinese authority on biblical literature, Su Weizi. Now, Su described the style as being of classical elegance and expressed his regret at the discontinuation of the translation. Surprisingly, the translation was not continued, although the British and Foreign Bible Society had already agreed to the 2 conditions that Yan gave for its continuation: that his translation be submitted to a committee of 3 or 4 missionary scholars, including competent Chinese Christians, and that his committee not change the style, but only mistranslations or departures from the original. These would be referred to Yan again, who would make them in his own way and in harmony with the general style to finally be approved by the committee. Now, you can hear the excitement of the British and Foreign Bible Society in the following report. They said, a translation of the scriptures into Chinese by a really great Chinese scholar and stylist having his style and translation controlled or limited by a foreign missionary committee has never yet been made. A gospel so translated may become a classic and at any rate may rank with the very best Chinese literature. This was expressed in the midst of the translation of the Classical Union Version, which, according to this statement, was not expected to become Chinese literature to the degree that Yan's translation could. Now, I couldn't find a clear answer as to why this translation didn't continue, how it got canceled, if it was because missionaries or the British Foreign Bible Society changed their minds, or if Yan Fu himself changed his mind about the project. But it's a really interesting thing to imagine if this had actually gone through. And at the same time, it's controversial because there has been a long-standing debate about this whole thing. Can people who are not Christians translate the Bible? Should they be allowed to translate the Bible for like a Bible society or mission organization? Is it enough to have a committee of missionaries and Christians who are overseeing his interpretational decisions and let him be solely responsible for stylistic decisions? It's an interesting question, and it's also something that many people would be vehemently against, and then others would be vehemently, passionately supportive of, mainly because of its extreme potential for making the Bible into something beautiful, artistic, and a classic, just as his goal was. Now, so far in the history of Protestant Bible translation in China through the 1880s, we see a concept of a union version that people keep starting and failing. So there's a lot of these failed attempts. So what we want to do right now is turn to the chapter of Chinese Bible translation where a union version actually succeeded and see how that played out. A general committee conference was organized in Shanghai in 1890 by missionaries. And so they got together in this conference, and the question of Bible translation was discussed on the first working day, May 8th. 6 papers on Bible translation in China were presented, and a heated discussion developed between a guy named Archibald and a guy named Wright. Archibald was from the National Bible Society of Scotland. He did not see a union version as desirable at all, while Wright strongly promoted a union version. Now, though Archibald stood almost alone with his opinions, 2 committees for further consideration were appointed, one on the feasibility of a united Wenli version of the Scriptures, and another on the feasibility of a united Mandarin version of the Scriptures. Finally, on the 8th day of the conference, a report suggesting a translation of the Bible into simple but chaste Wenli was presented to the conference and accepted with great majority. Now, I'm going to skip through a lot of details in this whole development, but at the end of the day, when you're starting a new translation project, you have to decide what your basis text is going to be. Now, this is where a guy named Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener comes into play. He was a New Testament textual critic and a member of the English New Testament Revision Committee, which produced the revised version of the Bible. He graduated from Cambridge in 1835, and in the latter part of the 19th century, he produced an edition of the Greek New Testament which reflects the Textus Receptus underlying the English King James Version. So he attempted to reproduce as exactly as possible the Greek text which underlies the King James of 1611. So here's why this was necessary. You see, the translators of the King James, they didn't use one printed edition of the Greek text. They relied heavily on the work of Tyndale and other editions of the English Bible. So there were places in it where it was unclear what Greek basis of the New Testament was there behind it. And so Scrivener, in his reconstructed and edited text, used as a starting point the Beza edition of 1598, and then he identified the places where the English text had different readings from the Greek. So he examined 18 editions of the Textus Receptus to find the correct Greek rendering and made the changes to his Greek text. And when he finished, He had produced an edition of the Greek New Testament which more closely underlies the text of the 1611 King James, more than any of the other editions of the Textus Receptus. Now, if you want to look at this work, you can find it in the public domain. It's titled The New Testament in the Original Greek, according to the text followed in the Authorized Version, together with the variations adopted in the Revised Edition, published in 1881. So you can imagine that with this hot off the press, there's going to be a debate. Should we use this, or should we use the new text by Westcott and Hort, which has just come out? They released their copy of the New Testament in the original Greek in the same year, 1881. And so they were producing a critical text compiled from some of the oldest New Testament fragments and texts that had been discovered at the time. And they worked on this project for 28 years. So their edition departed from the traditional Textus Receptus, and this was a big step in the history of textual criticism. Most critical editions published after Westcott and Hort share their preference of the Alexandrian text type, and therefore are similar to the New Testament in the original Greek edition. They favored two manuscripts, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and they believed also that the combination of Codex Bezae with the Old Latin and the Old Syriac represents the original form of the New Testament text, especially when it is shorter than the other forms of the text. Now, a guy named G.E. Moule with the Christian Missionary Society, he was one of the most outspoken of the critics of the chosen basis text for the Union Version. So in the conference's resolutions, he saw that there was great uncertainty as to what text to use as the translation's basis, and it was merely recommending the text that underlies the revised English versions, with the privilege of any deviations in accordance with the authorized version. So basically, it was going to be a hybrid, and it would require the translators to have some level of textual criticism knowledge. Now, at the time, the three Bible societies had neither published nor officially sanctioned the English Revised Version and its Greek text. So Moule stated that though many of the translators were experts in Chinese language and literature, they lacked the expertise in textual criticism which would be necessary for an evaluation of the correctness of either text. He himself favored and proposed the use of the critical remarks on the Greek text of Scrivener, whose suggested changes were much more traditional and conservative than in the text adopted by the English Revised Version translators. Even though every effort was made to persuade Moule that the translators belonged more to the conservative faction, he resigned from the translation committee in November 1891, when the three committees met in Shanghai. Now, eventually, 18 principles of translation were adopted for the Union Version New Testament translation. Here's a few of these principles. Translate Greek and Hebrew words occurring in different places and used in the same sense by the same Chinese words. When practicable, use the nearest Chinese words to express weights and measures, terms in natural history, botany, etc., putting in the margin, when necessary, their actual value if ascertainable. In other cases, transliterate the original words. Render euphemisms in the original by corresponding euphemisms in Chinese, and use euphemisms in other cases when desirable. Retain metaphors and comparisons so far as possible. When, in the division of our work amongst the translators, books are divided, take special pains to make the separate parts uniform in style and expression. Make a special effort to render literally words and phrases which have a theological or ethical importance, and which are, or may be, used by any school for proof or support of doctrines, putting explanations in the margin if necessary. As readableness is essential to an acceptable version, allow more freedom of expression and arrangement of clauses so as to secure perspicuity. In translating the poetical books of the Old Testament, preserve the form of the Hebrew parallel as far as practicable. When any passage in the original is ambiguous, adopt as a rule that rendering which seems best to suit the context. When two or more interpretations seem quite or nearly equally good, give one in the text and the other or others in the margin. While general uniformity of style is desirable in the whole Bible, do not press this so strenuously as to obliterate the individuality of the original writers. So what did they finally decide about the textual basis for the New Testament? Well, here's what the committee decided. Number one, that in our text, we adhere to the text underlying the Revised Version without deviation. Number two, that where there is a substantial difference of opinion among the five critical authorities collated by Scrivener, we give the alternative reading in a note. So in spite of all these decisions and principles, unfortunately, the Easy Winley version of the New Testament was severely criticized for its translation mode. Sheffield, one of the strongest critics, wrote that the Easy Winley work has passed far beyond the line of acceptable Chinese in its striving to reproduce the thought of the original. Missionaries even demanded a continued printing of the old classical versions to counteract the shortcomings of the Easy Winley New Testament. Quote, "They do inasmuch as they believe that whatever value the new versions may possess for instructed Christians, Chinese or Western, they are distinctly less calculated to convey the vital truths of our religion to the semi-instructed reader than the old versions. In this respect, they think that the so-called Easy Winley version is less intelligible than, for example, the old High Winley of the delegates. It appears to them that with the highest motives, the committee of translators have made the hazardous experiment of imitating Greek idioms in Chinese. For example, in their use almost invariably of certain Chinese particles in a manner quite foreign to the Chinese idiom and perplexing even to scholarly Chinese readers." End quote. Gibson, the committee's chairman, defended the version of the 1907 General Conference. This is what he wrote. "I am aware that the Easy Winley version has been criticized as following the Greek too closely. But the requirements of Christian students, as well as of the general reader, seemed to us to make it imperative to provide now a text which will bear minute and thorough exegetical study. That it would first give offense as requiring more thought and study as compared with the old versions which have become familiar from long use, was only to be expected. This has been the case with all new versions from the Vulgate on." End quote. He also added later, there were many things which they, the Easy Winley translators, were bound to put in that were not Chinese, because they were not in the mind of man when the Chinese language formed itself. As Christian thought permeated the Chinese mind, Christian thought would also permeate and modify the Chinese language. End quote. Now, the Easy Winley translators were given the following instructions. They were to, quote, "avoid the use of words and expressions that belong properly to the Mandarin, and shall use the classical connections, as also the classical euphonic particles, and shall seek to give expression to the thoughts of Scripture in the use of the most usual classical characters, and in the simplest classical idiom, aiming at a style of rendering that may be understood by men of limited classical culture. It was also understood that they should use the two-character expressions whenever desirable and clearer, and should try to make a version which, as far as possible, would be understood when read." End quote. So the original goal of being understood by people of limited classical culture or when read aloud was neither reached nor even seriously aimed at. The translation's foreign syntax and mode of speech were difficult for everyone to understand, regardless of their level of education, unless, to quote the words of the committee, it was read with the Greek New Testament lying open beside it. One guy compared this New Testament with the English Revised Version. Here's how the English Revised Version is described in the Cambridge History of the Bible. The reviser's ideal of faithfulness, quote unquote, in translation, was a meticulous word-for-word reproduction of the Greek text in English words, using the same English word for a given Greek whenever possible, leaving no Greek word without translation into a corresponding English word, following the order of the Greek words rather than the order natural to English, and attempting to translate the articles and the tenses with a precision alien to English idiom. The result is that the revised version is distinctly translation English. So if Chinese were substituted for English, this description would fit perfectly the Easy Wen Li Union version. Another person wrote, "This work, by its literalisms and crabbed style, dug for itself a deep and effectual grave." So in other words, those are not the kinds of reviews you want for your new Bible translation. Now, keep in mind that this was not the only attempt at Bible translation by this whole Union Version project. So originally, 3 versions of the Chinese Union Version were planned. 2 classical Chinese versions, one that was higher, one that was lower. One was more complex or more elevated language, and one that was more simple. And then a vernacular Mandarin Chinese version. But what happened was they ended up joining those 2 classical Chinese translations into one amalgamated classical version. And then they focused on another vernacular Mandarin translation. Now, as the Old Testament classical translation progressed, here are some further translation principles that they articulated. Being Scripture, it is a truism that nothing can be added and that nothing contained in it can be taken away. But it is also to be remembered that if the Spirit is conditioned by the form in the original, it is also conditioned by the form of the translation, and that as suitableness of form is secured in different languages by different devices, a really excellent translation can never correspond more closely with the original than the 2 languages themselves correspond. Seeing then that exact correspondence is not attainable, what are the important characteristics that we should look for in an ideal translation of the Bible into Chinese? Near or at the very top in our enumeration, we may safely place perspicuity. Whatever toil, patience, and learning a translator may show, they will all go for naught when it is unintelligible to the reader for whom it is intended. Amen to that. The ideal translation will be in easy, smooth, rhythmical style, a style equally acceptable to the cultured and uncultured reader. Again, the ideal translation will religiously avoid the evils of extreme literalism. It should be a matter of course that a Chinese version should be in accordance with the genius of the Chinese tongue. Chinese has been cast in a mold all its own and shaped and polished, as it has been by centuries of isolation from the rest of the world. It refuses to take on the subtle niceties of Western tongues. These must be compensated for by the subtleties and niceties of its own. So it seems to be that they're learning from their mistakes in the New Testament version. Another current error is to be guarded against. The ideal translation will not insist on always translating the same Hebrew and Greek word by the same Chinese character. The Bible is an ancient book. An ideal Chinese Bible should not lack a suggestion of its antiquity. This may be imparted by adopting for it, to a certain extent, the style of the Chinese classics, but it will be well, for the most part at least, for perspicuity's sake, to reject uncommon words and words not well defined, and even common words in archaic meanings. Above all, should be discarded set Confucian phrases and expressions which, however adequate and appropriate they may seem at first sight to embody scriptural ideas, yet by their association with Confucian rites or modes of thought, naturally and inevitably suggest to classical scholars erroneous and sometimes harmful ideas." End quote. Now, of course, these are awesome ideals to uphold and put into place, but when the rubber meets the road, things get dicey. So you're dealing with people with strong opinions. And here's how this actually played out in the committee. We get this interesting detailed window into how things were going between the translators on the committee. This long description gives a good idea of the dynamics and the most important points of discussion and consideration among the translators. Quote, Dr. Matier was a fine speaker of the Shantung or Shandong dialect, indefatigable in his preparation, anxious to secure a translation of the Bible which all could understand, as uncompromising as he was loving, a block of granite, and withal a born leader of men. Mr. Owen was a rare speaker of Pekingese, to whom it was a delight to listen as he preached or gave Bible lessons to his students. Mr. Owen knew what he believed, was a man of firm convictions and able in debate. He, too, came to the meeting splendidly prepared. Dr. Woods was a man of culture and refinement, of dignified bearing and rare courtesy, and withal not giving up easily results he had reached after hard labor in his study. He was our best Greek scholar and knew the precise meaning of every Greek word and particle. Mr. Clark was a good expositor, desirous of giving the right meaning, quiet in debate, and working for harmony. But now we sit down to our task, 10 men, including our teachers. We are trying to settle the text of the book of Acts. How simple it looks in English, but almost every verse means a battle. It is not easy to understand each other with our 5 sets of pronunciation and tones, but we all understand English. A verse is read and the debate begins, sometimes as follows. The style is too low, just what the coolies on the street use. But we want a style that even the coolies can understand. The trouble with our Bibles is that they have been translated for the learned and not for the common people. This phrase is quite impossible in our section. It is a classical phrase with us and would never be understood. But it isn't what the Greek says. We are translating the original language of the Bible, and it is our duty to give the meaning correctly and without a paraphrase. But I maintain this phrase gives the correct sense. We are not here to render the same Greek word always by the same Chinese character. I hold that if Luke, the author of Acts, had been writing in Chinese, he would have used this phrase. And I am sure he would have never written it. I wish the members of the committee to note carefully just what the Greek word means. It never has the sense which we are asked to give it, while the translation I have given renders the word perfectly. That would do very well if we were writing in the classical style, but we are making a Mandarin version of the scriptures, brethren, to be understood by everybody when read from the pulpit. Yes, we are making a Mandarin version, but we must render the original into a style that is chaste and crisp, or our version will be laughed at. I want to say right here that if I had known we were to translate the Bible into a classical style, I would never have allowed my name to be on the committee. I have very important work waiting for me that I ought to be doing at this moment. I beg, brethren, that you will speak in Chinese. We are carrying on our debate in English, and here are 5 native brethren sitting by quite ignorant of our remarks, who might help us with the proper rendering if we spoke in Chinese. We all agree, and presently are talking again in the language in which we were born." End quote. So this guy's description, a very honest description of the committee's work, points out 3 major problems. First, differences in translation principles. 2, the lack of a standard form of Mandarin, and thus differences in perception of what written Mandarin should be like. And number 3, the inability to communicate in Chinese owing to the substantial differences in the Chinese dialects of the translators, and thus the effective exclusion of the Chinese members from the translation work. Now, as the Old Testament Union version continued to develop, a guy named Absalom Seidenstricker was added to the team or committee, who was a very gifted missionary. Eventually, though, he had to leave the translation committee, and in several letters written to the executive committee, he explained why it was impossible for him to work any longer with them. And although his description of the committee work is by no means objective, it does give us an interesting idea of what was going on behind the scenes. His complaints about the principles of translation were that the translation was neither colloquial nor faithful enough. And also, He said that it was not a translation from the Hebrew, but from the American Standard Version. Nevertheless, his final reason for resignation was another one. Here's what he wrote. The revision committee is seriously embarrassed in its work by the fact that one member of the committee, and he, the leading one, exercising the controlling influence, is entirely ignorant of Hebrew. I refer to the Reverend F.W. Baller. Whatever other qualifications he may have for translating work, his entire ignorance of Hebrew de facto disqualifies him from Old Testament translation work. Despite this fatal defect, he is the most prominent and the leading member of the committee and is laboring in every way to make the translation his own translation, supported by the committee. Number 1. Early in the year, Mr. Baller sent to the other members of the committee his translations of their work, so that they each had his translation before them in doing their work. A subsequent comparison of the different translations shows clearly that Mr. Baller's was closely followed, in places literally copied, by some members of the committee. Number 2, when Mr. Baller sent me his translation of the larger portion of the text assigned to me for translation, he suggested that I take his translation in lieu of making my own, which of course I declined to do. Number 3, in the committee room, Mr. Baller used every means to make the whole translation his own, to the intense disgust of at least some of the Chinese assistants. Number 4, in the review by the committee of the portions assigned to me, Mr. Baller treated me with the greatest rudeness. Finally, at the last meeting in which I was present, Mr. Baller asked me to resign from the committee. I was blamed for being, quote-unquote, happy in the work, as if anyone could be happy doing work under such circumstances. His sole objection to me was that I did not fall in with his plan to make the translation his work, for which he has been so strenuously laboring, end quote. So it's really apparent that there was this clash between two men of very strong will. Now, to confound the whole matter, Baller, even though he was a missionary of the China Inland Mission, was a Baptist, which was a doctrinal orientation which Seidenstricker could not accept, and a fact which surely encouraged him in his prejudices against Baller. But at the very least, Seidenstricker's complaint about Baller's lack of knowledge of Hebrew is justified, because Baller, unlike the other translators, had never received any formal theological education. But in spite of the loss of Seidenstricker, the translation continued. Here's a really interesting quote from Baller in 1919 about the increased contribution of the Chinese assistants. Quote, a most interesting feature, however, was the growing keenness and interest on the part of the teachers as they caught on to the idea of the revision. Each vied with the other in contributing his best to ensure both accuracy and good Chinese, a combination not easily obtained. The run of a sentence, the balance of its parts, the rhythm, the rounding off of a phrase, the different use of characters and certain connections, and 101 other things that grow up with a man in the language in which he is born, were all considered and decided by them. No rendering was adopted in regard to the Chinese of it without their agreement. Many stumbling blocks have thus been removed that would be apt to turn away an educated Chinese from reading the scriptures because the translation was foreign in its usage of language. Goodrich also mentioned that the teachers were increasingly helpful in 1914. He says, our teachers' work is invaluable, but it is in working with us, tasting words with us, feeling the quality and sensing the swing of a Chinese sentence with us, that their value chiefly appears. End quote. And one of the greatest differences in committee work under the leadership of Goodrich was that the Chinese assistants had the right to vote in decisions regarding the final text, which was not the norm. And once again, it's really, really sad and unfortunate how the Chinese assistants were treated, especially in the record keeping. They were hardly ever named or mentioned. Finally, on April 22nd, 1919, the first edition of the completed Mandarin Union version was received from the printer. This publication, together with the publication of the Wenli Union Version, brought a temporary end to the largest Bible translation project in the history of the Chinese Protestant Church. 1919, the year of publication, was the 30th year after the decision to translate the Union Version was made at the General Conference in Shanghai in 1890. In the translation of the Mandarin Union Version alone, 16 Western translators had been actively involved, with an even higher number of Chinese translators. 31 Western translators had taken part in the entire Union Version scheme, and the cost of the project amounted to approximately 12,000 British pounds. In Christian circles, the Union Version has stirred up controversy from immediately after its publication until today. Interestingly, this discussion reached its most heated point about 60 years after publication. This was the time of the publication of two important new translations: today's Chinese version, published in 1980, and Shengjing Shengniben, published in 1976 and also in 1992, both of which had to be justified in comparison to the Union Version. But it also coincided with the completion of a full traditional Chinese cycle of 60 years, a fact which was referred to by several authors. For the first review of the completed Bible in 1919, the opinions of several missionaries in China were collected. The version was praised for its colloquial Mandarin and its greater faithfulness to the Greek and Hebrew in comparison to the Peking version. The revisional changes to the already published parts, like the New Testament, the Psalms, and the Pentateuch, were noted as great improvements, though sometimes not sufficient in the abolition of non-Chinese syntax, and in other cases going too far and losing the meaning of the original text. The review was concluded by some remarks of Harold B. Rattenbury of the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society in Wuchang. So here's what he said. On the whole, my feeling is that this is the last and the greatest translation of the Scriptures, where the burden of the work ultimately rests on foreigners, but that the final Chinese version will be very different, especially in the New Testament. It wants emphasizing over and over again that the Chinese version can never come until Chinese translators arise. 1, with a genius and love for Mandarin. 2, with a first-class knowledge, not a mere smattering of Greek and also of Hebrew. 3, with skill and practice in translation, such as some of the commercial press writers possess. 4, with an entire devotion to truth and the truth. The final Chinese version will never come until we have Chinese scholars, deeply versed in the original tongues, masters also of Mandarin, translating into their own native tongue. It is for the church to prepare her Hebrew and Greek scholars. Amen and amen. I couldn't agree more. And that's what we need across Bible translation today, I would add. The missionaries of the early 20th century had learned from past experiences that the Union Version could not be the ultimate authorized version in Chinese. It was understood that the translation had the limitations of every translation, which was mainly made by foreigners, even if they had spent most of their lives in China. Also, the ideal of one authorized Bible translation in every language had dramatically changed at the turn of the century. The English-speaking world had recently seen the publication of several new translations, each of which had found its niche, and in the process robbed the authorized version of its sole position of almost 3 centuries. Possibly none of the missionaries of that time would have expected the Union Version to eventually become the primary Bible of the Chinese church for at least the rest of the century. And I would also add that they didn't expect this kind of KJV-only type of mentality to develop around it eventually. Now, besides the early complaint about the Union Version's lack of faithfulness to the original, especially in comparison to the earlier editions of the Union Version, one of the sharpest critics, Gu Danru, of Donghai University in Taichung, brought forth a number of criticisms. While working on a concordance for the Union Version, published in 1961, Gu tabulated 56 shortcomings of the translation in 3 categories. Number 1, errors in the choice of words. 2, grammatical and stylistic problems. And 3, mistakes in translation. In the last category, only a few instances were listed, as in cases where the original meaning of a phrase, which was too difficult to translate, had been changed, simplified, wrongly understood, or not clearly analyzed. The first category included terms which had changed meanings or become obsolete in modern Chinese, terms which were too colloquial or dialectal, transliterations which could cause misunderstandings or were of a length of 7 syllables or more, and wrongly written characters. In the second category, grammatical and stylistic problems, Gu counted the inharmonious mixture of classical Chinese and Mandarin, mistakes of obsessive faithfulness to the original, or unclear or stylistically uncouth phrases. Finally, there was another point of criticism of the Union Version later that was an objective point of criticism that basically said the advancement of biblical studies since 1919 warrants a revision. And this was disregarded by the conservative majority of the Chinese church as not important enough to justify a revision of the Union Version. Nevertheless, in the 1980s, a revision was finally made of the Union Version, but it never caught on with the same popularity as the original. Now, possibly the most important factor in the history of the Union Version and Chinese missionary Bible translation was the missionaries' changing understanding and perception of the Chinese language and its different styles. A guy named W. Wright of the British and Foreign Bible Society writes the following: "In every country having a written language to which missionaries have gone, they have yielded to the literary pride of native scholars and made the style of the Bible too high, with the result that new translations have to be made into the language of common life, sometimes more than one before the proper level was reached. The Bible Society has spent many thousands of pounds in vain through this mistake of translators." End quote. The linguistic limitations of the foreigner in Chinese were finally realized, as well as an understanding that language was subject to change, meaning that no text, including a Bible translation, could retain its meaning over indefinite periods of time, a very important point. So ironically, by the time the missionaries had arrived at that conclusion, the Chinese church had developed a conservatism of its own. Throughout the 19th century, Bible translation had been the story of missionaries. They guided or undertook the translations, and they also decided which versions to use for their churches. In the 20th century, the Chinese church had become an independent entity, ready to voice its own view for the first time. The result was a majority perception of the Union Version as an authorized version, a far broader majority than anyone would have anticipated. The authorization of the Union Version experienced in the Chinese church was not endowed because of its merits as a good translation, but rather through its status as a Chinese canonical book, which is viewed as authentic and not to be altered. What has been called the King James Version effect, referring to the view of the language as sacred and unalterable, regardless of the quality of the translation, manifested itself in China to a perhaps unparalleled degree, possibly because of the very name of the Bible in Chinese, Shengjing, Holy Canonical Book. This phenomenon differed greatly from the missionaries' previous loyalty to earlier versions. And so the Chinese Mandarin Union Version has maintained its supremacy through 8 decades because of this perception in the Chinese Protestant Church. And so that about wraps it up for our story of the Bible in China. Once again, most of what you heard today comes from the book by Dr. Jost Oliver Zetsche, his book, The Bible in China, The History of the Union Version, which you'll find linked in the description. Working for the Word is a podcast where we believe that the Bible is a unified, God-breathed, God-centered, hope-giving book, sweeter than honey and pointing to Jesus. This podcast exists to help us all treasure the Bible more, go deeper into it, and become like the man of Psalm 1. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode with more interesting things from the world of Bible translation.